We are at week 3, lecture 2, and we have gone through to this point the first two books of Lewis's great work, Mere Christianity. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about books 3 and 4, complete the book. And of course, this is Lewis's Apologetic, formed as originally a series of radio addresses to which he added more material as time went by. But this is a wonderful example of doing Christian apologetics from a variety of different perspectives. And in book 3, he's going to deal with the question of morality, Christian morality. Now, you may wonder why that has anything to do with apologetics. It really does, because one of the areas at which we as Christians would have some affirmation about our contribution to the understanding of the human condition in the world is in Christian morals, or Judeo-Christian morality, as we might want to put it a little more expansively. And so he spends the longest section of this book, about 70 pages or so, on the subject of Christian morality. And it's a very helpful little treatment here in this great little apologetic. And he talks about here in the first chapter of this particular section, morality being concerned with three things. First, with fair play and harmony between individuals. And that's pretty much of a no-brainer. In fact, he makes that point. He says that for most people, this is what morality is, and that's really all that it is. But then he introduces a second issue, which is what we might call tidying up or harmonizing the things inside each individual. And this is something that you would get with some other religions. Buddhism would probably deal with this. To some extent, Islam would deal with it. But specifically, religious people are those who would feel the need to have some kind of orientation here because they sense that there is a God who judges them, and therefore they need to sort of tidy up the insides. And then point 3 is the purpose of human life as a whole. What was man made for in his terminology? What were human beings made for? And then he pretty much follows that threefold outline throughout the entire treatment here. And it's a wonderful expression in Christian teaching. In fact, some of the most quotable material in the entire book is found in this book 3. So I would commend this to you, careful reading, maybe reading it more than once, and the sort of thing that you could pass on to other people. He has a discussion here of the fact that there are, in the history of the West, what we might call cardinal virtues, and these cardinal virtues were elucidated by the great Greek philosophers and Roman philosophers, people like Plato, obviously, Socrates, Aristotle, and others. And the 4 cardinal virtues are prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. And he has a great discussion in chapter 2 about each of those 4, and I think does correct some misunderstandings about what some of those things actually mean. And of course, later on in this book 3, he will deal with the 3 theological virtues, which come from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, faith, hope, and love. And so this is a nice way, a convenient way, a pleasant way, and not only that, but also a way to sort of ease into a conversation with someone who is not a believer about what the nature of Christian morality actually is. Now, we have a very limited amount of time in this lecture to deal with the issues raised in this book. And so I would commend you especially to the chapters where he deals with some interesting things in sexual morality, which is one of the chapters here. Stuff that dates him in some sense, because he sort of has the basic conclusion, or the basic assumption, I should say, that sexual morality, as understood by people who have been raised in the West, especially, sexual morality has to do with fidelity in the relationship between a husband and a wife, man and a woman, that extramarital or premarital sexual immorality is wrong, and also that sexual relationships are not intended to be experienced between people of the same gender. He gets into that in even more detail in the chapter on Christian marriage, and I would commend that to you. He's got some things there to say that also would be considered by some people in the evangelical community today to be somewhat old-fashioned, anachronistic even, because he clearly holds to a complementarian view of marriage. That is, that men and women, the husband and the wife in the marriage, contribute something different, and that there needs to be leadership in the home, and the leadership should devolve primarily on the husband. He's not talking about some kind of hardcore patriarchalism here or anything of that nature, but that at certain points in a relationship between a husband and a wife, decisions have to be made, and the husband should be the default person that is turned to in that kind of situation. I believe that's what Paul teaches in Ephesians 5 and other passages in the New Testament, but obviously it would take a whole lot more tweaking in a lecture to draw that out than we have time to do here. I think one of the great chapters in this treatment is the chapter 7 on forgiveness. And he treats some of these things with a sophistication and a subtlety that you rarely find even in good books on the issue of forgiveness. I've read a number of books, including David Augsburger's book on breaking the chains and forgiving other people, which is a helpful book. But this chapter here, I think, is very helpful in that he begins with this idea that you've often heard that you should love the sinner but hate the sin. And he says some people today don't like that idea. And I'm telling you, there are a lot of people today in the Christian community, and certainly the outside Christian community, who would reject that notion outright, altogether. But he said, just relate it to yourself. You're supposed to love yourself, but do you always love everything that you do? Obviously, the answer is no. This is a wonderful insight from somebody who has spent time thinking about it, not as a cleric, not as a pastor, but as an intellectual who came to faith in Christ and has tried to look at some things here from the standpoint not of a professional Christian, as we sometimes would think of that term, or a career ministry person, but as an outsider. An outsider in the sense that he's not part of that inner communion of people who do their ministry for a living, but as a philosopher who happens to also love Christ and love him very deeply. There are things in here that you might find objectionable. His approach to killing, for instance, and to war. I personally resonate deeply with a lot of what he has to say, and I think that he's right. Like what he says here on the top of page 119, when he says that all killing is not murder any more than all sexual intercourse is adultery. When soldiers came to St. John the Baptist asking what to do, he never remotely suggested that they should leave the army, nor did Christ when he dealt with the centurion, and has some other things to say in reference to the war. And of course, this is somebody that we can look to with some authority because he was a soldier in the Great War, what we now call World War I. The chapter on pride is remarkable. And if you've read Augustine's Confessions or almost anything else by Augustine, the Enchiridion or the City of God, you would realize, as I pointed out before, how devoted Lewis is to an Augustinian understanding of God, but also an Augustinian understanding of sin, and particularly that the greatest of all sins is the sin of pride. He has wonderful things to say about that. I, again, wish I could read every quote and put a highlight and asterisk, which I've done in my book, but wonderful things to say about this. And then finally he gets down to the three theological virtues at the end of this book, charity, hope, and faith. And I like the fact that he divides faith up into two different sections. faith sometimes refers to the faith. That is what we believe. That's something that you would find in dispute among some people, that faith is just the act of believing, not the faith. But I think that passages like Jude verses 3 and 4, and other passages like that would make it very clear that even the New Testament uses the term the faith for referring to those things that we believe to be true. And so he has some great things to say about that. And then also the section on personal faith. Now, when we get to the final section, it may be of surprise that he would go so far as to deal with that most difficult of all Christian formulations and understandings and theological expressions, which is the Trinity. But what he tries to do here, and I'll just summarize this in a minute, what he tries to do here is to show that the notion of the Trinity is not intended primarily to be an abstract theological construct available only to people who have had many years of theological education or who have functioned as philosophers, which is the case with him, but that this is something very pragmatic. And so if I can point out one or two pragmatic things about this, then I will leave you to read this. He has a section on time and on the fact that God exists beyond time. That's an Augustinian idea as well. And that this is how God can respond to prayers. That what we pray today, God anticipated we would pray perhaps 100 years ago, already has been involved in the process of answering our prayers. It's, again, a disputed point. Some would argue that if God does not experience time the way that we do, that God cannot understand us. I would counter, and he counters as well, the fact that God can understand us, first because he created us, and secondly because the second person of the Trinity entered into the life of human beings in his incarnation. And then one final thing I would say about Trinity here and the practicality of it. Without the doctrine of the Trinity, we don't really have a full-orbed way of expressing any hope for salvation or redemption. Because you see, God the Father is the lawmaker, God the Son was the law keeper, God the Spirit is the law enabler in our lives. And he has some great illustrations here about how we can image the Trinity in our own thinking. He avoids the problematic views that sometimes were expressed by older theologians. But what he's trying to do here is to show that Christianity is intrinsically believable, even to the point of some of the most difficult things that Christians affirm in the area of Christian morality and in the doctrine of the Trinity. I think Lewis has done a remarkable job here, and I have no doubts about why this is considered to be a great book.